Hello again, and welcome to cPDH.vibes, the official partner podcast of cPDH.guide. I'm your host, Adam, also known as BeachBodGod69, along with my co-host, Ben, South Lakes Vibes. Ben, how are you doing today?
I'm well, I'm happy, I'm hyped. I'm looking forward to talking about today's topic of aggro. Very exciting. Adam, how has your week been?
My week has been great, and I'll tell you what, Aggro is a really, really fun archetype. I'm excited for this. You can probably hear my dogs. They're excited about this too. You can hear them barking in the background,
Dogs
hopefully. But
famously are very aggressive animals, so that suits the
they
theme.
are, they're Chihuahuas, and I think Aggro is the Chihuahua.
Yeah.
They
We
are.
got a
They're
thumbnail.
that's the archetype that we're talking about today. We got little dog, little big dog energy going on with this good topic for today.
So before we dive into it, Adam, have you been playing any cPDH recently?
Not at all. Not as much as I want to. But though I do have tomorrow, there's actually a nice plug for a cPDH tournament in Monticello, Minnesota. Looking very much forward to this. It's at the Lewis Game Store. Yours truly, Magus of the Jank, also known as Ethan, is setting it up. So if you are in the area and you've got nothing else going on, please do join us. I'll be there, as well as some of my good friends locally. I believe Clay is going to be there as well. So there's quite a few of us that are going to be showing up for a good local tourney.
Yeah, it's gonna be
So
fantastic, dude. I'm really excited to hear about how that all goes down. On my end, I've been doing my best to catch games. Time zone always makes it difficult, but I've been playtesting a lot of a new deck I've been put together called, which is Kelith and Siani. So Kelith, some may be familiar, and Siani, Eye of the Storm. Zoria's partner deck. It's kind of a hybrid thing, not really aggro, but on the aggressive side of mid-range combos. So that's been a lot of fun. Otherwise, get putting together the pieces for Brushfire Elemental. That deck's finally together, and the last couple of pieces for Akiri, Fearless Voyager. So yeah, on my end, I think I've been holding down the fort on the experimental side of things, playing a lot of games, getting crushed by Abdel Black over and over and over again, to the point that it becomes masochistic. But yeah, I've been having a fantastic time.
look,
So
don't yuck my yum, okay? I'm just saying.
yeah, don't know. Abdel Black is like one of those decks that just kind of like lurks about in the background because everyone knows what it does, so very few people want to experiment with it. And then it comes back once in a while and reminds you why it's one of the best decks and why all Abdel decks are amongst the best decks in the format. I mean, it's such a brutal grind machine and it's so capable of wiggling out of almost any hole that you put it into. Um, but that's a topic for another episode. So in this episode,
Raising. Yep.
we decided that we wanted to talk about aggro at large in the meta. And we're talking about different ideas about what we could do an episode on. And this is something that's been in the rotation of conversations we've had in our daily chats, in the Sanctuary Discord server, uh, trying to think about which archetypes are doing better or worse and why we don't see more aggressive decks in the format. So, Adam, why do you feel that aggro is an interesting topic for an episode?
Well, I think that aggro, if you look at the rock, paper, scissors, dynamite that we have for our archetypes, is that there's always going to be this concept of I just want to beat something to death with creatures, right? That's usually the go-to. I think aggro is a really it's fun to play, I think. I mean, again, that's going to be subjective to every person, but there is something that's very distracting. I mean, if you're playing control, which is to date the most successful, at least to our meta data, the most successful archetype across the board, aggro tends to lean into that and actually pressure the opponents well in the combat steps. So having a presence in the pod where you've got creatures that can pressure your opponents and negotiate that way to be forceful, I think it adds a lot of spice to each game. And so that it really is something that I think is essential to balanced gameplay. That's my take on it. What about you, Ben? What do you think?
I'm gonna have to pick you up on that point about control there because actually, it turns out unsurprisingly that combo is actually the winningest archetype according to the most recent data, but we can get into that shortly.
Really? Oh, okay.
Yeah. So aggro for me has always been kind of this big boogeyman in the sense that it's always been seen as kind of an essential and healthy component of the format, but we don't have a lot of people in the online space doing it very often, and certainly not doing it very consistently. And as we're going to get into in the data, it's not a particularly attractive archetype to a lot of people. The kind of general heuristic, without yet talking about what we mean by aggro, is when people talk about it, is they generally tend to mean something which threatens pure combo players. And I think what we've seen is the dominance of a small number of decks in the meta, in spite of a very wide range of decks being played and considered viable, which are very insular, and we would struggle a lot more and subsequently be a lot less well represented if aggro was more prevalent. At least that's the theory, and I think that's why people say they'd like to see more aggro decks. But what is interesting is that whilst people have a lot of respect for decks that are relatively well known, particularly basically any deck plus Kedis, we don't necessarily see a lot of them. And I think when we look at the data, we're going to find some really interesting insights about how well aggro is actually doing, what its strengths and weaknesses might be, and what we could do to help it gain some more popularity. So shall we move from that into trying to talk on kind of the first bullet point that we've nailed down here, which is kind of what is aggro, question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Clay did a nice video on this too, and I'm kicking myself. I swear, I thought the control was number one. It's combo, huh? That's too bad. But
when in doubt, combo's a pretty safe bet, mate.
I know. When in doubt, to
in
combo out,
games,
right?
it do be popular,
right? Right. But I think aggro. Clay did a video on archetypes a while back. It's a couple years old, so I mean, there's probably some updates that we all have to kind of take with a grain of salt with that. But I think there was a real push on aggro seeks to pressure the opponent with damage, and whether that's in the form of combat damage through creatures, whether it's in the form of direct damage through pingers or other reach spells, whatever the case is, you're trying to apply damage pressure is what I see aggro as. In a way, you can have non-damage be aggressive. Like you can threaten with combos early on, and using like tempo, I think is another form of it. But really, I think aggro is just pressure, and at its purest form tries to pressure early. But I think that it can happen at any point in time. That's how I look at it. What about you? What do you think, Ben?
Okay, so I think everything you've just said is very pertinent, and we're going to touch on more of it as the episode continues. I want to go back to Clay's video first of all. So of course we're associated with cPDH.guide, and cPDH.guide data is maintained at least by at least two individuals. There's Clay, who we've mentioned, and a friend of Clay's named Bodan, who is a stats professor in real life. Bodan has very generously given us a big chunk of data and some effective ways to represent it, which Adam and I have gone to great pains to try to summarize and extract kind of core insights from over the last week. So, with the premise that we're going to be looking at the data at least a little bit, it's only fair to be clear on where these labels come from. So, at least in the more recent past, Clay himself has been labeling commanders that have been performing well in events or have turned up in events in order to categorize the data and therefore be able to extract this information that we're going to dive into. So, Adam, you mentioned Clay's video. I've talked to Clay since about how we apply labels in this space.
Yeah.
And his definitions have changed a little bit. So I think, as per your point, we're going to look at this more like kind of general rule of thumb, basic ideas that Clay's been looking for when he's been looking to characterize decks as aggro, control, mid-range, or combo. So the general rule of thumb for aggro is that, as you said, low curve for a deck allowing early pressure through creature damage. I think the creature damage thing is kind of ephemeral. To do damage one way or another. If you are running interaction, it's largely tempo based. It can be sorcery or instant speed, but it's designed to buy you time against other people, and you tend to use it relatively proactively. You look to tend to take cheap threats and inflate them in some way, and there's a band of strategies around whether you look to make individual threats very large very quickly, or whether you look to go relatively wide, and what the balance is between your efforts to slow people down versus push ahead. But crucially, Cray attempted to summarize all of this and make a kind of general hand in the air rule of thumb when I last spoke to him, and say that he feels an aggro deck typically is looking to do about 30 damage, i.e. kill a player or deal lethal one way or another by around turn 5. Now that personally is, I think, a very reasonable rule of thumb for what aggro decks should be looking to do. You want to ideally removing at least one player around the turn 5 mark. But there is so much to talk about in my view,
it's a big topic.
when it comes into what these labels actually mean. And we're going to talk in a minute about what the purpose of labels are, but just to give a flavor of things that I thought about when I was coming up with this. So here we go. Firstly, you've got the conversion turn. How quickly does your deck actually win? And what would we decide was an adequate, average win turn to describe a deck as an aggro deck? You've then got the banding around that turn. For example, if a deck can win on turn 3 through combat damage 30% of the time, but wins on average around turn 6 or something later, do we still consider it an aggro deck? Conversely, if a deck wins on turn 6, but it does so consistently, does it still become an aggro deck? You then got this additional constraint of deck composition. And if I was to show you, Adam, a deck that was nothing but interaction, you would probably not jump to the conclusion it was aggro, even if the creature in question was some kind of prowess or sprite dragon type creature that took advantage of that interaction to be able to murder someone relatively quickly. And so there's an intuitive understanding we have when we're looking at a deck that informs whether or not we want to apply this label. And then there's a win condition. I mean, if I showed you a creature that won with Infect, but it did so by turn 4, you would still describe it as an aggro deck, even though we're no longer talking about either damage or commander damage. It might also be a deck that looks to mill everybody out by that period of time. And if it's doing so without using a particular combination of cards, but with some innate synergy with the commander, i.e. it's not combo, we still might describe it in turn to be an aggro deck. Does the flavor then change, and does the range of problems that this archetype encounters change dependent on what your specific win condition is? There's a rate of deaths amongst other players. If you kill somebody on turn 3, another player on turn 5, and another on turn 8, versus killing everybody on turn 7, do these decks, should we consider them in the same way? Do they fall prey to the same weaknesses? That in the same vein, there's symmetrical versus asymmetrical damage. For example, Dago Kedis is a very well-known and very popular aggro deck. It deals symmetrical damage to finish the whole table. Does that deck suffer different challenges as a result of making itself absolute arch enemy versus a creature like, I'm going to keep coming back to this example, Picnic Ruiner, which is a small creature with double strike, which can kill a player on turn 3, another player on turn 4, and another player on turn 5. And there are, innumerable more examples you can lean on in this vein. You can really keep extending this discussion as far as you want. So I've talked for pretty consistently for about 2.5 minutes there, Adam. Did any of that seem reasonable?
I think it is reasonable. I mean, I was doing my best to not add my usual color commentary like spread of deaths, murdering lots of people. I'm thinking, wow, so violent. So it goes through my mind. But like when I'm looking at some of this stuff, I agree. I mean, you look at a deck and you see, wow, it is mostly creatures that are designed to turn sideways. That might be an aggressive strategy. But I do want to be very clear when we look at what is aggro, when we're talking about things, I think every deck has an inherent vulnerability to it, right? Every deck has the ability, we identify the weaknesses almost as we play too. When we look at these decks in the pod, where are the moments that we can take advantage? And one thing that I really want to push hard, because one of the things you mentioned before is it's tough to, we talked about how tough it is to really define an archetype and to label it, right? And I know that we're going to kind of lead into that later, but I think it is important to recognize that aggro is not just a strategy or a design, but it's also a tactic that can be used by any archetype, right? So if there is a moment, like I'm going to use Gretchen, for example. If Gretchen, which I believe is a control deck at heart with a combo finish, right? it uses untappers, and there may be, rarely, but there may be a moment where, hey, my win condition was taken away, and my opponent has been beaten to a pulp with single digit life totals left with no blockers. I might use the untappers to win. I might aggressively attack them, even though Gretchen isn't an aggressive deck by design, right? So I think recognizing the fact that everything that we're talking about today too could potentially be a tactic, not of a deck within a pod, like when you're piloting, versus a design of the plane or the vehicle, if that makes sense. And I think that that's something to keep in mind as well as we're talking about this forward.
Absolutely. I mean, and so the broader conversation is more about like the successful, or the correct approach not only in game but outside of game and how the two intersect. And so there's this again, it's kind of an infinite conversation. So I'd like to move into our second, I suppose actually technically our third point of consideration, which is kind of why we care about labeling archetypes in the first place. I don't know if you probably see the same, Adam, but like quite a common response I get when this topic comes up or I introduce the topic with people is a kind of disinterested reluctance to engage with it because the third party in question doesn't think that it's productive conversation. And I'm sympathetic to why. I think that most decks in our format do play very differently to each other. But I wonder what your view is on why we should. Do you feel we should care about labeling decks? Do you feel this is a productive way to think and talk about the format? Like, why do you think people are so interested in not just this format, but more broadly in trying to figure out the scope of these labels?
Gosh, that's a great question. First off, I'm going to just say, how fortunate are we that decks don't play the same? You know how boring that would be if we had just the exact same. Like if we had 4 players in a single pod playing identical decks, archetypes. I mean, it would be an interesting case study once in a while, but the variety is huge, and I think even the
variety is the core of Magic at large, no? So
well, in this format too. I mean, we have so much that's untapped that we haven't. No pun intended, but so much that hasn't been used or explored yet. And I think in a way, these labels being somewhat vague allows us to define them as we go, which is in its own right positive. I think that there are a lot of people that disagree with that statement, but if we have, player A saying aggro is creatures turning sideways and player B saying aggro is how fast and how much I pressure, and aggro could be all of these things. And as the meta changes, I think it's good. But to your original question, are these labels helpful? More than anything for the new players to understand a concept of how a deck tends to function. I think it's just good having an operant, even flexible, but still something operant. That's a definition of, how does this work? What should I expect?
It's like it gives a vibe for what you roughly an indicator of what you're supposed to be doing in order to win, or what the original designer of the deck intended for you to be doing. Maybe I think that premise of like a label being like an onboarding tool for newer people, or like a way to give it like an immediate 1-syllable like snapshot or 2-syllable snapshot of what a deck is roughly trying to do is an interesting premise.
Well, and I just wanted to point out too, you and I should really start talking a little bit more about vibes and about cPDH at some point. If only we had, a platform where we talked about those general vibes in the cPDH format, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, dude, if only. Okay, so we I had like 3 or 4 ideas here for what the label's purposes could be. I wanted to run them through you with them. There's identifying unsuccessful strategies or successful strategies in the meta at large. I think there's a constant effort to kind of figure out why some decks work and some decks don't, and a way to be able to eyeball somebody's new deck and figure out if it's worth your time investment. And I think all players do this. We all kind of take a glance at something and figure out if it catches our attention or not, and we try to figure out if it could be successful or not. And a lot of that time it's kind of intangible gut feeling / leaning on some experience. I think that trying to characterize things in terms of labels, however profitable or not, is our go-to mechanism for trying to figure out how to build better decks. Um, the second point would be identifying trends in the meta. I think when we see new things emerging or existing things emerging, we want to figure out what they have in common. And I think that labels, being able to attach labels to things, okay, this is an indicator that aggro is doing well or combo is doing well, etc., is more like a hypothesis, I guess, for what these different decks or different commanders might have in common. I also think there's kind of an aesthetic component to a lot of this. Um, I think people just like using labels to describe things. I think people like saying, "Oh, I'm playing control deck or a combo deck or whatever," because it kind of is kind of flavorful with whatever they're doing, and we are playing kind of a fantasy game after all. And the last point I wanted to touch on was that it's worth noting that labels aren't exclusive. We tend to give these one-word sound bites to describe what the deck is doing because it's the easiest way to reference it in conversation and communicate it clearly to someone. But decks have all kinds of intersection. There are decks that are very aggressive, which also combo. There are decks which may use a tempo or a Voltron strategy or a chaos strategy or something which can also function as aggro decks. There's all kinds of intersections of decks. And the more adjectives you attach to your project, I think generally the better you're able to communicate it to other people. But we have a finite amount of time to do so. And so I think actually the choice of labels we use for decks is very important. And I think figuring out what the best, biggest buckets we can put decks under is a worthwhile investment, even if sometimes it seems very complicated.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, that way we have a language to speak about and get to understand how does this work? How does it tend to function? And take for example, like this deck is it might be the color red, not the magic color red, but like the crayon color red. And then as you get to know it, well, it's actually more of a magenta or it's more of a burgundy. And then you get to different shades where it might get all the way to like tickle me pink instead of light red, right? But the point is that
Sure.
I don't know. It just showed up. Tickle me. I don't know
Sure.
what other colors they have. But the point is that you can get to a point where you can say, "Nah, this is Dargo Ketis, and Dargo Ketis performs in a certain way, right?"
Yeah.
Versus running Bird Horse or something like that.
Right.
It's just important to understand that this is the general Venn diagram. It's in this big circle, and we can narrow it down as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Birdhorse and Dagoketis there. I'd like to jump actually to talking about different philosophies people have around aggro. Um, so, like, again, aggro is a band, right? It's a bracket that encompasses a wide range of things, or it's multiplanar, multidimensional. There's lots of different decks that the pilots are happy to attach the word aggro to that actually look functionally very different to each other. There's a few kind of core strategies I think we could give some examples of. So the first one is rush down. So in my view, rush down decks that are more aggressive are decks that are looking to kill people significantly before the average game would normally end. The decks that tend to forego a lot of protection, maybe in some cases forego a lot of interaction, to kind of shoot the moon and see if they can get away with cheesing a very early win. The best example of this is Dargo. So Dargo is a mono red deck which comes in our format with the essential caveat that it's almost impossible to defend the creatures and it's probably not worth your time to try and do so. You do get some specific creatures like Goblin Chirurgeon, which can sacrifice itself to regenerate target creature. But generally speaking, Dargo wants to just kick your head in, and it's a deck that wants to be able to win the game on turn 4 or 5. It's tricky. It's not something that appeals to everybody. I think for a lot of mid-range players, it strikes them that giving up their toolbox and giving up their a range of options is unattractive. But this is a deck that attracts a lot of fear at the table, and it encourages people. In fact, it outright forces people to mulligan for interaction a lot of the time because this deck will murder you consistently if you give it the breathing space to do so. The second one I wanted to talk about was kind of the idea of distributed threat. So this foregoes the premise of a single kind of basket you dump all your eggs into in favor of some kind of broader distributed collection of creatures or collection of win conditions that then make you more robust to single target removal. The best example of this in the format is Gut Leader, in my view. Gut is a 3-mana creature which lets you essentially sacrifice existing creatures you control in order to make skeletons with Menace. Then you then play a background, typically Inspiring Leader, which will then buff the skeletons further, in addition to any other tokens you make. Gut is actually typically a turn 7 deck, but it passes every single turn holding up a lot of mana, giving it kind of a flavor of tempo as well. And the key point is that you can remove skeletons individually, but they're going to keep coming back. And they're big 6/3s with Menace. That Gut kills a player pretty convincingly on turn 5, another player on turn 6, and another player on turn 7. So this is a really scary deck to be sitting down across the table from. The next archetype I want to have a quick talk about is Hybrid. So Hybrid decks kind of are capable of killing people early, but they're not panicking if they can't do it. So 2 examples I give would be Sprite Dragon, Crackling Drake, with a shout out as well to Horrid Shadow Spinner, which isn't quite aggro, but certainly can put pressure on people. So Sprite Dragon and Crackling Drake are small Izzet creatures which get bigger when you cast non-creature spells one way or another. And the idea is that you spend most of the deck looking for combo pieces and incidentally murder people with your enormous Izzet Dragon thing. They are explicitly not as fast as most other decks that identify as aggro in the format, but they normally put one player in the grave by turn 5 or turn 6. So you're dealing with a small number of opponents, and then when your creature is inevitably removed, you can either play it again or you can focus on looking for your combo finish. And the last sort of mini bucket I think is worth talking about here would be tempo. So, Adam, I think you probably watched Clay's video recently as well, and you'll remember that Clay said that he feels that tempo is kind of a nebulously defined thing that depends a lot on who's talking about it. For my purpose
I
here,
would agree with that. Yeah.
yeah. So my purpose here, I would say tempo is a strategy whereby you establish some kind of early, potentially scaling threat, or you ramp into some kind of larger threat whilst doing your best to slow down everyone else's clock, i.e. interfering as much as possible with what everyone else is doing. The classic examples, I'll say examples in the format, are the deck you mentioned, Adam, Bird Horse, which is the community name for Keleth Sunmane Familiar and Isior Wardwing Familiar. Azorius commander pairing where attacking makes the partner creatures bigger, but the Isior also gives pretty reasonable protection to both of the commanders. They both start small, but your small investment, both of them being 2-mana creatures, means that you're free to, after sort of turn 3 or 4, hold up basically almost all of your mana for interaction every single turn if you want to, with the odd pump spell thrown in, and to refill your hand at instant speed or otherwise because you are in blue and we have access to draw power, whilst you try to drag everyone else out into the sort of turn 6, turn 7, turn 8 mark, whilst murdering a player ideally around the turn 6 or turn 7 mark. The other example would be Sailor's Bane. Sailor's Bane, you kind of get squabbles about whether Sailor's Bane is a tempo or a control deck. It really just depends on how it's built. It's kind of a meme. I don't know if you agree with that, Adam, but my view is that Sailor's Bane, like, it's not seen to be very effective, but it does fit this tempo. It can be built in very convincingly as a tempo deck in that it's a 7-mana, I believe a 7/7 creature, or possibly slightly more expensive than that, with something like Ward 4, and it costs 1 less for each instant or sorcery you own in the graveyard or in exile. The idea is that you're mono blue, you just annoy people, you have quite quickly resolve a huge threat for a small amount of mana. It's kind of similar to like mono blue terror and 60 card pauper, or you're using your Tolarian terror, etc. And you then beat people to death with it. I think that those 4 points, so again, rush down, some kind of idea of a distributed threat, hybrid decks that do attacking people and then do something else as well, and then tempo, is a reasonable bracket around most of the aggro decks you will see in the meta.
Oh, so one thing I should mention, I guess, is I guess it's kind of its own separate category, so it probably is worth mentioning. Are creatures that pivot around some kind of core evasive keyword, or defensive keyword, I guess I should say. So I'm thinking specifically of creatures like Slippery Boggle and Invisible Stalker. So those creatures, I guess, ha sacrifice some of the reach that you get with more explicitly aggressive creatures, and also some of the defects against like edicts, for example, or the lack of variety of threats you get in a gut, in exchange for matching up extremely well into a very broad band of decks in the meta. Basically, if you're hexproof or you have ward, I mean, to some extent, various Wilson decks can do this too. I'm not sure there's. I haven't yet seen a Wilson deck which comes under the category of uh, aggro specifically at Wilson Red, maybe, but Wilson is a decent example because Wall 2 is very annoying, it's very sticky. But certainly, Boggle and Stalker both want to come down early. You want to load them up with buffs, hold up a couple of pieces of interaction, and beat people to death with them having very few tools for a course. The trade off for that being the clock. I've considered building Boggle several times. I cannot conceive of a setup whereby even if you rip out all the interaction, you are reliably killing people any earlier, a single player, than turn 4. I mean, and that is really pushing it. You are probably looking at turn 5 most of the time. And crucially, it's not even then necessarily a turn 6, then turn 7 kill. It's often like a turn 7, then a turn 9 kill, which is really stretching the definition of aggro. Again, hexproof, extraordinarily powerful. You do still get hosed by fogs. There are, other ways people can interfere with what you're doing, a Stonehorn Dignitary, that sort of thing. But uh, that is an interesting angle to explore. There are some creatures like Nightveil Predator and Venomthrope that people can put in those camps. In my view, those are mid-range decks. They simply do not have the pace to fall under this category. But we might yet see a creature that walks across those different fields. But this is an angle people have explored. You just don't see it very much because, frankly, black control is a thing, edicts are a thing, and these creatures are either seen to be not exciting enough to attract the actual aggro players, or not compelling enough to attract the more mid-rangey players.
Uh, how do you feel about that, Adam? Am I missing anything?
I agree with it. I think that the use of tempo to that one point is that it is pretty, as you said, nebulous or just kind of. It's such a homogenous word because it can be used for a lot of things. So one thing that I would say is it also impacts board development. So if you're
Yeah.
building your board really quickly, the one deck that comes to mind more than any that we don't see enough play of, which I look forward to trying to work on, is Heritage Druid, the elf deck where you play a bunch of one-drop elves very quickly. I know Clay has made that a pet project of his, and Derek has a list that he runs as well. So that in a way that like that mass quick tempo piece of it too, but in a way that kind of falls under the rushdown almost,
Yeah.
or the distributed threat.
I would
But
put it under rushdown. I think there's plenty of
yeah,
decks that like to go wide quickly.
yeah,
The
yeah.
reason I think Gut is the Gut deserves its own special mention is because it doesn't necessarily go extremely wide, but it goes wide enough that it's annoying to deal with, and it's able to pass
Such a
most turns
dangerous
holding up
deck.
all its interaction. Um,
Yeah.
but I mean, again, even as I'm describing all of this, it's like, where does Arabella fit into this? Arabella isn't really any of these things.
Well,
You could argue
I always saw, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I always saw Arabella as, I mean, this is where that Venn diagram component comes into play, right? Because, I mean,
exactly.
it's not, I mean, Boros by design really wants to turn sideways and hurt people, right? But I see, even though the ability is turn sideways and hurt people with Arabella, I see the deck almost more mid-rangey,
Yeah, no,
in the way that it
100%.
plays compared to
Yeah,
Gut. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, it's just different strengths and weaknesses, and there's again, it almost comes back to your earlier point that maybe aggro is more of a philosophy for roughly what the deck should be doing than it is a prescription for what commanders are viable or meet that criteria, or what cards go in the 99. Um, I think that the general premise is it might. I was thinking earlier, it might be more appropriate to describe aggro in terms of what the community wants it to be, which is a foil to combo, which is just
yeah.
anything that's deemed effective in order to threaten combo players and therefore balance the format out more. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I agree. I think that we need more aggro in my mind. We need pressure because in my take on how most games go, there we negotiate to a win, right? We negotiate to the place that we want to be with the other players in the pod. And the ability to apply pressure in that setting to the life total, to take away longevity from a player if this doesn't happen, or just to increase one's own position, especially against decks like the Simic decks that have just been dominating. It's just so important that we have the ability to do that.
I think that's a point we're talking on. So just before we move on, the basic premise of aggro keeps combo in check is that you've got as the format becomes slightly slower, i.e. aggro is less present, people are worried less about the life total early on. The idea, at least, is that combo decks feel a lot safer to invest a lot more of their mana explicitly digging for combo pieces. We can't really talk about this without talking about Gretchen, Titchwellow, or Leyen Lawweaver, which are the premier combo decks in the format, but very explicitly. It's not that there can't be decks that can challenge them, etc. But if you're looking at pure combo decks that aren't interested to do nothing but popping off, that are the purest instantiation of that, but is also doing extremely well. These are the best options you get access to, and as their life totals are threatened less and less early, they can spend more and more of their time just setting up. And these are decks that can win around as early as turn 4. In some cases, it can cheese wins on turn 3. The idea is that if you do have decks that are threatening those players and are incentivized then to threaten those players very quickly, those decks not only have to spend more time looking for answers, but they also have to change their entire list. So it is not uncommon to see combo players foregoing actual technical interaction, by which we mean, as a community, kind of mean stuff that affects what other people are doing at least as well, or in addition to protecting your own stuff, in exchange for pure protection. Cards like Tamiyo's Safekeeping, that grants Hexproof, Snakeskin Veil, etc., where they're purely interested in just making sure they can do the thing when they need to, which is proving successful. The argument is, if those decks are forced to run actual removal, which in Simic again would be something like Echoing Truth, spells like like Unsummon, etc., they're going to have less protection when they go for the actual combo. So it's a way of attempting to disincentivize. Greed is a loaded term, but disincentivize insular deck building in a way that slows those decks down and gives other decks in the meta a chance. Now, I'm not endorsing it, I'm not disputing it, but I think that is generally, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, that is generally what people have in mind when they say we need aggro to check combo.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, it does come down to, it affects. Yeah, I mean, to your point, until we get a sideboard for. I'm going to talk about this forever until we get it. No, until we get a sideboard for our decks. These combo decks are going to have to follow and just guess and check like the rest of them on how we deal with. Man, how do I survive long enough to get my combo in? Do I have to run more fogs in my Simic deck at Moment's Peace? Is that going to save me today? I only have one. Do I want to use my tutor to get a fog or two, or get a combo piece? And so, yeah, and finding those moments to pressure and cause bad decision making on your opponent. It's worth
noting like how many decks we have that are considered to be amongst the best decks in the format that don't explicitly win with raw combo. And again, this is a separate whole different video and whole separate topic, but I mean, Abdel is considered one of the best commanders in the format, period. Abdel is not a pure combo deck. No variant of Abdel is a pure combo deck. It makes a bunch of 1/1s and beats you to death with them. It can bleed you to death when those 1/1s leave, or it can, beat you to death with Abdel by making him unblockable. It can, if you're playing Abdel red, then you're hurting people with pingers, etc. Like, there's a deck which combos very effectively and very easily. If you look at Malcolm Kedis or Malcolm Breaches or any Malcolm variant, these are decks that can combo again very effectively. Have a lot of redundancy. They convert a creature into a pirate and then look to use that pirate to make a bunch of treasures. And then typically use those treasures to then continue the damage chain somehow, deterministically or otherwise. These decks do an enormous amount of damage. And so it's not just the case that all combo decks are insular, and I don't necessarily know that aggro matches up equally well into all of these. And so there is a genuine question of, is this just kind of is the interest in aggro at large the ghost of resentment towards particular decks in the meta? And is that actually, when people talk about fighting combo, balancing combo, are they really just, as we've just done, kind of tunnel visioning on one or two decks that they are sick of playing against?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, and the other thing too, let's face it. I mean, aggro does best when you've got one opponent and a lower life total to knock out.
Sure.
And it does not do nearly as well when you've got higher life totals and multiple opponents to knock out. It's simple math when it comes to. I mean, Prof actually did a couple of commander, like just vanilla commander videos on this on his channel that I watched a while ago on different archetypes. Big shout out to what Prof has done for the community. He even did something for our community. But the point is that yes, in the general sense of 1v1 Magic, aggro does a beautiful job of trying to knock out combo. And it's harder, though, when the archetype has more of an uphill battle. And that should be talked about, I think, at least mentioned. But the other thing that I think is unfortunate is that in 1v1 Magic, at least, you get to see a greater balance of some of these archetypes, because like mid-range is killer, just killer in 1v1 Magic, and I would say is superior to aggro at times. But I don't know if we've really seen, because I noticed that mid-range has really slipped in our format lately.
I don't know if it's slipped as much as never had a presence, but well, I don't know.
I was being nice about it.
Well, I don't know. I think there's so much to talk about here, but that point is super interesting, because there is definitely a sentiment that Magic was built to be a two-player game, and as you move into a four-player game, the resource war becomes so important.
Sure.
And the number of opponents becomes so oppressive that maybe certain strategies just don't become so viable. And so it's difficult to see how certain strategies like mid-range can be effective in a space where you've got three opponents who are all trying to interfere with whatever you're doing. And by extension, when we look at aggro, it can be difficult to see how certain commanders that look promising on the surface can ever get to a point where they're consistently eliminating multiple players who all, by turn 5 or turn 6, have a good chance of seeing at least one piece of interaction.
Before you continue, one thing I want to say too is that aggro does tend to get a little noisy at the table. If you are by design, a little noisy, almost as noisy as these chihuahuas, which hopefully you can't hear right now, but the chihuahua aggressive, the one that's going after the opponent. I mean, if you are actively, it's like a declaration of war. And the more aggressive somebody is at the table, it causes waves, it causes vibes at the table that, man, that's threatening. They must be the threat, right? Yeah, no, and that's so that could also be an element at play here.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, it's a difficult mindset, I think, for people to be in. I know, Adam, you're a very defensive player, and when I joined the format, I certainly would have identified more as a defensive player, and still probably do for the most part. But it's a difficult thing to sit down at a table and, as a pre-game action, people decide that you need dealing with, right? And to understand that that's what people are going to be thinking, and you have to play into that and fight through it. When you're sitting down and already having to fight three opponents, to have an unusual level of attention on you, I think, is unattractive for a lot of people. With all of that said, maybe we should stop beating around the bush and we should dive into some data.
Mm-hmm. Yep, let's do it.
Should we do it? Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
We've waffled a lot. As we said at the start of the episode, Bodan has given us a chunk of data. This data covers April 2024 till March 2025. These are games mostly collected from tournaments. We have data for 317 games, with breakdowns by the archetypes ascribed to the decks, as given mostly labeling by Clay for each commander, the average turn at which a deck wins, the colors that we're using the decks, and then the breakdown of data by seat order as well. So we've got lots to dive into. So it's going to be very interesting it has been, excuse me, very interesting to try and figure out which of any of these data points has been worth discussing. But I'm going to start by identifying two key points, I think. The first thing regarding commander data, we're going to reference a few commanders that have performed well. Bodan's explained that for commanders to be included as a point of discussion in his data, they have to meet some flat threshold for a number of games won. Now, to be clear, the data at aggregate includes everything. But when we reference, for example, we're going to reference Furnace Hellkite, for example, Alexios and Arabella, all of which are aggro commanders. The reason we're mentioning those commanders specifically is because they have won a suitable number of games. And the second thing worth mentioning is performance. So if you do watch cPDH.guide videos regularly, you won't need this explained to you. But performance is a metric we used, which is sometimes called, was originally called winningness, but now winningness is a component of performance. It's basically an indication of how well something is doing. So performance is very simple. It's how well the thing is doing as a percentage, i.e. how often it's winning, what percentage of games is, for example, are aggro decks winning, what percentage of games are won in seat 1, minus representation. So, for example, if 10% of decks that turn up in all games are aggro, and aggro wins 15% of the time, the performance of aggro is 15 minus 10, which is 5. Conversely, if, I don't know, 20% of decks were control, but control is only winning 10% of the time, the performance would be 10 minus 20, which is minus 10% performance. And this is how we evaluate how well or poorly something is doing. Happy with that, Adam?
Yeah, I'm good with it. I'm curious about what. So I get the measurements. I'm good with it. What's the data that's compelling? Let's get into it.
Let's go. Okay, so across 317 games, we had. We go by seat order first. Okay, 94 games were won by player 1. That's a 30% win rate by player 1. 75 by player 2. That's about 24% win rate. 57 by player 3, 18%. And 58 by player 4, so 18.3%. So the core is, if you're ahead in seat order, you are likely to be winning more games. But crucially, seat 3 and seat 4 are actually fairly equivalent, which, I don't know, Adam, I found that quite surprising.
Yeah, I did too. And looking at the data, it is marginal. But seat 3 was the worst. I mean, it's marginal, but it's still...
No, 100%.
Makes you wonder.
Yeah, 100%. The remaining of those games are draws. The reason I think it's worth mentioning is because I think we would intuitively expect that aggro would depend a lot on seat order in terms of likelihood of success. And I'm going to get into that because it's really interesting. But just before I do, it's worth noting that aggro decks at large tend to win on average, regardless of seat order, or seat position, on turn 9, which it's worth noting then that the average conversion turn in general for the format is turn 9. So aggro decks are winning on when they're winning at the average speed, which I found very surprising. Likewise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, it's really weird. It makes me think that when these decks are winning, they're probably being blown out once or twice and then recovering and picking up the pieces, or they're capitalizing on something else, something that someone else is doing. It's worth noting that the average win turn in general is turn 9, but it spikes actually surprisingly hard at turn 9. Outside of that, it's relatively flat between turn 6 and 12, which is, again, it could be a product of the sample size. So, Adam, what do you guess? Close your eyes for a minute. What do you think the most popular archetype for this year, 2024 to 2025, was, and what do you think the least popular archetype was?
Oh my gosh. Okay, my eyes are closed. I'm thinking. All right. Most popular archetype, I'm going to say it's got to be mid-range, would be my guess. But then the least popular is tough. I'm going to guess control.
Okay.
That would be my guess.
To reiterate, the 4 buckets we're using in this data are mid-range, combo, aggro, and control. So mid-range is essentially anything which is kind of toolboxy. It doesn't win particularly quickly, doesn't win with combo, but is looking to leverage some kind of value proposition to win over time. Combo decks tend to be predominantly interested in finding a collection of cards in order to go infinite and then outright win the game. And control decks tend to be slower decks that look to grind people down and win in the later stages of the game by establishing some kind of unchallengeable threat. So you said mid-range would be the most successful, and you said control was the least successful. You are correct. So in terms of decks,
Hold on, successful or
edit that
popular?
out. That's you caught me. You caught me. I fell into my own trap. Popularity is what I asked about. Mid-range is the most popular archetype amongst all deck games played. 34% of decks fell under the mid-range bracket. The least popular is control with only 15%. Combo and aggro are relatively equal, around 27 and 23% respectively. So
Wait,
aggro,
did I get them both right?
Yeah. Mid-range.
Yes, I did.
34% for mid-range and 15% for control. So with that said, mid-range, combo, aggro, control, in order of descending popularity, what do you think the winningest archetypes were? Winningest archetype and least successful archetype?
I mean, the least successful I know is mid-range. I know that. We talked about, we hinted at that. I mean, it's the most popular, but it's just not, it's not cutting it yet. We got to crack that code at some point. But, well, you said it wasn't control earlier. So is it combo?
Yeah, of course. So it is, in fact, combo. Unsurprisingly, as above, so below, as in cEDH. If you're not comboing, you're probably not winning. Combo winning at about 8% performance. So again, if 20%, what is it? 27% of decks are combo decks. So it's coming in at roughly 35% winningness of combo decks across all games. 35% is very high across 317 played games. The least successful, as you point out, Adam, was mid-range at -9% performance. So that means that mid-range decks are winning something like 25% of the time. We can talk about pet theories of that. My guess is that there's just a lot more decks that fall under that bucket innately because they don't necessarily fit into one of the other criteria, which and there's probably a lot more people playing them more experimentally. So I think it's only to be expected that they don't do necessarily quite as well. But it is interesting nonetheless. So with all of that said, we've already acknowledged that the average win turn is turn 9. Just a quick question. What do you think the average win turn for combo across all seats is?
That's tricky. I think combo would try. I mean, if we did X weavers, like if we took weavers out, I think most.
No, it's in there. You can't just take it out.
It's in there. I can't do that. Okay, all right. So throwing weavers in because weavers tries to get
any deck that would describe itself as a combo deck predominantly. You got to think Cormella and the new goalkeeper. Or it's not actually in the data, but you know what I mean. All sorts.
Yeah, I would say probably it's got to be in the mid game. So I would say probably turn 5, 6 is realistic. I'm gonna say 6.
I think that would have been. I think that's a kind of reasonable, if a little optimistic suggestion. It's actually turn 8. So combo on average, when it's winning, is only winning 1 turn faster. But it is worth noting that most decks are winning around that at a very small band around turn 9. So this is where it gets really interesting when we get into the data for seat order. So Adam, you would expect that aggro was doing well or poorly in seat 1 when it's winning. The tempo boost. Let me try that again. In abstract, is it doing well or poorly in seat 1?
Just in general, is it doing well or poorly? Okay, I would say, I mean, intuitively, I think aggro would benefit, even though it would be very noisy, right? It would be very much like drawing attention to itself.
Sure.
But I would say seat 1 should help aggro, would be my guess.
This is kind of crazy. Seat 1 is it's a good seat to be playing aggro in. It's at 4% performance. So if you're winning, you're probably with aggro, you might well be in seat 1. But what's crazy is that combo is at 7% performance in seat 1. You are still better off playing a combo deck than you are playing an aggro deck in seat 1.
Really?
Not by much, but yeah, that's very interesting. The best colors to be in is red, and the worst colors being is black, which I thought was kind of cool. There are 3 commanders that turned up in the data that were worth talking about that were winning in seat 1. There were Furnace Hellkite, Alexios, and Arabella. So if we want to quickly touch on those, so Furnace Hellkite is a big dragon, gets cheaper for each artifact you have in play, and it has the community name for it is Fire Breathing, where you pay an amount of mana. I think it's 1 mana to give it +1 power or something till end of turn. It also has flying. So it's a big threat that is cheap and easy to recast. It's kind of like Sailor's Bane in that respect, but with affinity to artifacts. There's another creature in the format called Oxider Finisher, which is affinity for equipment specifically. I think Furnace Hellkite is regarded by most people to be something of an upgrade. Alexios, 4-mana creature, comes down, exchanges control between each player at their upkeep, and then must attack, can't be sacrificed, and gets bigger whenever it moves between players. And Arabella was the focus of our last video. Arabella, Boros creature, 2 mana, attacks, it does damage to each opponent and gains life for proportional to the number of creatures with power 2 or less that you control. Adam, the success of those 3 commanders in particular, does that what you were expecting? Do you think you're familiar with those names? Obviously, like, was there any names you were expecting in seat 1?
I was hoping to see Dargo Kedis in there.
Yeah,
I was really surprised. Yeah, but I mean the Hellkite, it makes sense to see him there. The other one that isn't represented yet that I think should be, is it Chandra's Phoenix? Is that the one?
Yeah, I love that creature. I don't think it's good enough for competitive play. It's hot take, but
You don't think so? I think it's got.
very good at yeeting one player into existence, out of existence, excuse me. But I don't know if it's got the reach to end the whole game. But yeah, no, the creature, and I can't remember what the creature's called, but it's a 3 mana, 2/2 flyer or 1/1 flyer, and it gets something like +3 power whenever an opponent is dealt non-combat damage.
Yeah, not Chandra's Phoenix. It's something else. I'll find
Spitfire,
it. But
I
it's
think is the one you're thinking of.
Spitfire is what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
And which means that if you use like I don't know, like a Dragon's Approach or something to deal 3 damage to each opponent, it gets +9 till end of turn. You just bonk someone. It's very funny.
Well,
it
gets wild with pingers. It gets absolutely wild.
Yeah, for sure. 100%.
Yeah, so,
yeah, it does nutty stuff. Okay, seat 2. Adam, Aggro doing well or poorly in seat 2?
That's tricky. So seat 1, I would imagine that seat 2. I feel like that seat is more like a responding seat.
Interesting. Okay.
So I don't think, I mean, the faster the better, but I don't think that seat 2 would be a good, I think it would be worse for aggro.
Well, overall. We could say, for example, that being a turn behind seat 1 means the seat 1 player is in a position to interfere with what you're doing. Aggro's at -8% performance. That's a very substantial deficit, I would say, in seat 2. Now, again, there's not an infinite sample size. It could be subject to variation. It could be a fluke, but it is worth noting that combo is at 18.5% performance in seat 2. 18.5. If there was something like 20% of combo decks, they would be winning the game in seat 2 38.5% of the time. It's almost 40% of the time. That is, sorry, let me try that again. Yeah, no, that's actually correct. Yeah, that is in phenomenal endorsement of combo. And the only aggro commander that was worth talking about in seat 2 was the Furnace Hellkite again, which won a small number of games. So maybe what we're seeing there, Adam, to your point, is actually that robustness is important.
I would say so. I mean, well, and that's, first off, that is so significant. That's almost a 3 times the success rate just from 1 seat position for combo. Right, and I know this whole episode is supposed to be around aggro, but yeah, 2.5, almost 3. And the other thing to consider too is that we've gone a whole 12% negative for aggro, from 4 to -8. So that, I mean, that is significant. I think that the Hellkite, we might have a new king for aggro as far as a commander goes with that Hellkite.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So seat 3, not to belabor the point, but seat 3 again, aggro at -12% performance this time. Even worse, seat 3 is definitively the worst seat to be playing aggro, and it's very unlikely you're winning on aggro deck, apparently, if you are in seat 3. Combo in seat 3 is at 21% performance. If you are in seat 3 and you're not playing a combo deck, you're being shortchanged, my friend. That is explicitly 3 times the seat 1 performance. That is an insane representation. That is so incredibly impressive. just to touch briefly, so colors in general not very significant, but seat 2 colors, you're better off playing blue. You're again not very well off playing black. In seat 3, you're best off playing white and green, and definitely not well off playing red, which makes sense, Adam, because again, red typically associated with aggro, and aggro doing very poorly. But this is where it gets really interesting. And towards the earlier point in the episode, we mentioned that seat 3 and seat 4 were roughly equally likely to win. So how does it fare for aggro? Yeah, just you've probably already seen the figure, Adam, but in a vacuum, if I was to ask you, give me a percentage like performance, what do you think for aggro for seat 4? If you've
Well,
never seen
if
the
I'm
data
looking, yeah. So if I'm being, so we went from, let's just recap. Seat 1 was a 4%.
correct?
Seat 2 was -8% for aggro. Seat 3 -12.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go down the line and say, let's say -20. Because why not, right?
Yeah, and I would agree with you. And the reason this is an important point to make is because aggro in seat 4 is at 12% performance, not negative 12, 12% performance. To recap, to be clear, there are 58 games won by seat 4, so it's not as big a sample size as, for example, seat 1, where there was like 90 games won. And we do have a significant number of draws. There's lots of noise in the data, but 12% performance is extraordinary. And what's really interesting about the seat 4 data is that there are no standout aggro commanders. So aggro at large is doing well, but aggro commanders individually are not standing out, i.e. there's a smattering of wins amongst all aggro decks, but no one aggro deck in particular is doing particularly well. So that, to me, suggests that maybe it's less of an indication that a certain deck or a certain value proposition is very compelling, and it's more that the ability to be aggressive and capitalize on other people's activity and maybe hold a lower profile is attractive. I don't know how you feel about that, Adam.
Well, holding a low profile in general, is part of my philosophy. Like when you're playing, but
yeah.
but it's just because it's not that, but also holding a low profile exclusively, explicitly causes high profile in itself. So you have to play ball, so to speak. But
Yeah.
12% for the good, and I'm looking at the data now, so I'm going to give the spoiler. Combo only did 1%.
That's what I
in
completely
seat 4.
forgot to mention. That's actually
And
unreal. Combo goes from 21% likelihood of winning in seat 3 to 1% in seat 4, which at that
so
point I start to think maybe we we careful how much we attribute to the sample size, but that is wild.
Yep, it is. Well, and the fact that there's such a discrepancy, because it seemed combo dominant the whole way through, but once you get to
100%.
seat 4, um, I think that the perception wins for aggro here, because
yeah.
they're supposed to. If they're aggro in seat 1, look out. Aggro in seat 4, you're cute. You want to play Magic with us? Like it's not like they're dangerous. And that could be it. Maybe I'm wrong, but
Maybe. So on average,
I don't
combo
know.
ends up being about, as we go back to recap to an earlier figure, combo wins is about 8% performance on average, and aggro is slightly underperforming on average at -1.5%. So we can see that reflected in the data that it sucks to be an aggro deck on seats 2 and 3. It's very good in seat 4 for some reason, reasonable in seat 1. Combo is great to be everywhere, and then still acceptable in seat 4. So just a quick note before we try and talk about it more broadly. Median turns. So when, like, at the most often common turn to win. Basically with aggro, you're almost always going to win on turn 9. Interestingly, control, it tend to be around turn 10 or 11. We'd probably expect that given control tends to be slower. But it's really not the case that there's one particular seat where aggro is just crushing people as quickly as it would like to be. In most cases, aggro is just battling through. Now, again, that's the median, so it's possible that a lot of that's just being not lost because there are lots of games where there's more games where the muddling is just happening and the crushing just is being drowned in the noise. But it's worth noting that whilst that's true of most archetypes, combo, and this is really interesting, when combo is in seat 4, which again is explicitly its worst performing seat, it is winning the fastest. The median turn for combo when it wins in seat 4 is 6.5, whereas almost everywhere else it's 8 or 9. Which is weird,
I think
right?
yeah, well, I think some of that too is environment. I mean, I will say combo likes it as an archetype, likes having itself not directly threatened.
Sure. Yep.
It likes to have time to find the pieces. It likes to have time by life total and by pressure, right? So 1v1, I think aggro is much, much stronger at killing combo than if we had a pod of one aggro deck and multiple combo decks. Chances are you just can't pressure all three equally, right?
Yeah.
So, and the higher life total makes a difference. But, God, that's so fast. 6.5. That's in the mid game.
It's just to me that like when
Yeah.
combo is winning in those seats, it's just gunning all out, abandoning responsibilities to try and take care of the table, etc., and just trying to make up the difference and cheesing wins essentially. But apparently doing it very well because again, it's actually positive performance even now, even in its at its lowest point, it's still a positive performance. So the only 3 commanders, aggro commanders that came out the data were Hellkite, Furnace, Alexios, and Arabella as one-off examples that were doing really well, even though aggro does have something to say for itself in seats 1 and 4. What does that say to you, Adam? Does it maybe mean that aggro in general there are lots of compelling options people are exploring? Does it mean that aggro, regardless even if you're playing a good commander or not, is capable of capitalizing on what other people are doing? What do you make of that?
What I make of it is that this is what was reported bubbled up by Bodarn, which again, Bodarn, thank you for all your work. We appreciate it so much.
100%.
I'm serious. It's fantastic work to have this for us. But we have a smaller sample size, and we're trying to grow the format as much as we can to get more variety.
Yeah.
And measurable like significance, whatever, of the data is how many repetitions have shown up. How much has shown up. But I think there are on the outliers, the fringes. We'll see other aggro decks get there. I think we just need to explore them more. But it's something to be said that. If it's red, it might be aggressive. All these decks are red, and so that's something to keep in mind as well, I think.
I mean, it's worth noting that if you are in seat 4, the worst color to be in is white, and the best colors are black and red.
Yeah.
In general, the winningest color in the format, Adam, you could probably guess what the winningest color in the format is.
Blue.
Yeah, of course. There's a 5% delta. It's very interesting, actually. So basically, there's no discernible difference on average across all seats and all games for which colors do well or poorly. Blue is the best, but it's like 1% performance. And 3 other colors are also like imperceptibly above performance. But one color in particular is underperforming asymmetrically relative to the rest. It's the only color that is underperforming on average. Which color do you reckon that is? Dude, check your notes. This is not an open book exam.
Is it? No, it's got to be white. Is it white or is it black?
It is black. Black is underperforming by about 6%. Oh, sorry, it must be about, it's about minus 4%. It's about 4% underperforming. Again, take that with a pinch of salt how significant you think it is. Again, that's over all games. That's like 317 games, about 170 or somewhere between 170 and 200 of which are actually won by people as opposed to being draws. That's very interesting. My read is that black is just a color that a lot of people gravitate to. It's just kind of a cool color that a lot of people like to play. If we look at popularity, black is one of the most popular colors people have access to. And so I suspect that there's just a lot of newer people who are picking stuff up, trying to get involved with the format, and maybe their threat assessment isn't the best, or they haven't had the time to optimize the deck properly, and so maybe black's doing very well. But
It's tough to speculate. It's tough to speculate on it, but I will tell you that those all could be valid. I think that the other part of it too is that we. I would say that a lot of the pilots that we've had transient pilots in our format too, to that point of having newer people in threat assessment. I know that some of the really scary, like excellent pilots that I know play black haven't shown up as much lately, so there's a little bit of that too. But interesting data.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
would not have guessed black.
Or maybe it serves to your theory that noise not good. Maybe black is a noisy color. Maybe
It could
black is
be.
a color
Could be
that
noisy.
attracts people. You've got cards like Crypt Rats and Pestilence. People get upset about Drown in Sorrow.
Gary.
Justice. Gary is the big daddy nasty. Yeah, interesting stuff. Okay, so we're moving towards the end of the episode, but I wanted to talk about a few things. So mid-range doing badly across the board. So winningness mid-range at -9%. Not very good, and actually bad in all seats. If you look at the performance, there is no seat where mid-range does well. It does badly across all seats. One thing that struck me when I was considering this, Adam, and why people talk about where we need more aggro, do you think that this like notorious, and I think it is notorious, I think the notorious underperformance of mid-range, which we kind of all know about and have always known about, sort of artificially shrinks the commander pool for a lot of people? Do you think that people want more aggro because it means it opens up a lot more mid-range options?
I do. I think that mid-range runs into a couple of issues, and we should spend. I think we'll spend some time, maybe even the next episode or one of the future episodes, on cracking the mid-range code. But just in a nutshell, without doing a deep dive, which I fully intend to do. Mid-range, I think, in a multiplayer setting, runs out of gas faster than any other archetype because it requires cards to have it answers proactively faster, and you can run out of answers. Yep, resource war.
Tools, so.
Yep. And then the other thing too, though, is that the absence of those successful mid-range strategies, I think, it makes combo better. I think it makes it disproportionately. It's an off balance kind of a thing in the meta is what can happen. But because mid range is so popular, we still have it. It's just not winning. It's like being used, and we got to figure out how to do that. That's my take.
And maybe most of these black decks are mid-range decks. I mean, black is famously a pretty good mid-range color. It has a lot of toolboxy stuff. As we mentioned last episode, it does a lot of things. Tutors, kills people, kills creatures, that sort of thing. So maybe that's the intersection.
It could be.
I think that there's a huge pool of commanders that don't necessarily lend themselves to going really fast and don't necessarily lend themselves to comboing, but have some kind of value proposition. And I think we see this a lot in casual games. There's a big variety of commanders people love to play with, that you and I, Adam, would look at and say there is just never, as cool as this thing is, it never has a hope of hell of making it into competitive. It could well be, I think, in the mid-range case that maybe it's just a lack of general direction. Maybe it's a lack of clear understanding of what the deck needs to be doing on turn A, turn B, turn C in order to win the game. Maybe it's just the idea of building a deck that does a wide variety of things and tries to include a wide variety of high quality cards and high quality effects, just doesn't hold up when other people are gunning for something. And to Aggro's selling point, it knows exactly what it's trying to do. It's trying to kick your head in, and the whole deck is built around that premise. So I think we talked about this writ large. Aggro, not horrible to play, pretty good if you're in seat 4. I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, Adam, is talk about what advice we give people if they told us that they were interested in playing aggro decks and making new aggro decks. So what would be your initial gut reaction for feedback? What's the first thing you think about when you think about what you're doing when you're building an aggro deck, or what you'd advise someone to think about?
Oh, that's a great question. I think if I wanted to play aggro, first off, I'm the wrong pilot to ask. I mean, the most successful pilots that I know of that play aggro, just off the top of my head, Caitlin won Sanctuary 2. She did a great job. Aaron plays Gut Leader and is consistently up there and very successful piloting Gut or Arabella. And
to that point,
I
we have
think
had other people in the format, Shadow and
yeah,
Azuriel, winning, getting top
yeah,
4
Azuriel, yep,
with Arabella before. So, and of course, there's a huge offline
fantastic.
meta where we see a lot of other people who, unfortunately, we haven't met yet. But
Yeah. There's others too, and then Liam too. I mean, he loves to go wide strategies and plays kind of that Zerg,
Dax, of course.
like yeah. So, but I'll do my best answer. So I would say number one would be very aware of who and how you're pressuring when it comes to acknowledging those windows, and being very aware of having a strict clock of how you play. And adhering to how can I maintain pressure? How can I continue pressure? To that point, though, I mean, this is more me telling the players, have a contingency of how you get back in the game, because someone will knock you out probably mid game at least once. I think.
I think that's like fucking. I'll edit that out. That's gospel, I think, for aggro decks. I think it's so important to work on the premise that you are going to get stopped once or twice, and unless you are attempting to win by turn 4 or turn 5, which is just about the cusp of where people will still might not feel comfortable holding up interaction, you are going to get stopped once or twice, and you have to be prepared for that eventuality.
Yeah, 100%. And then, having multiple ways to win too, I think is helpful. I mean, if it's dialed into one source, that makes it a challenge, because then someone can find out your strategy and knock you out pretty quickly. And I know that a lot of combo decks run this to their successes. They might have more than one outlet or more than one way to win the game, right? And for aggro decks, it might be, if damage is your thing, how can I apply damage in multiple ways to the end of winning the game, to that extent? Like, well, I might have a bunch of 1/1s, and maybe I'm not going to beat them to death with those 1/1s. I might have pingers. Well, if you can have pingers and Pro S, then you've got both attack and direct damage, right? So there's like different ways to apply damage. I think would be the thing to look at. And then Flaring Pain, I'm going to throw out there for your red players. You're going to love it. Don't forget that damage can be prevented, and that one fog prevents your combat damage that can end your attempt to win. So just that resilience in the deck too, not just how do I rebuild my board, but how do I have that Flaring Pain to make sure that I do hit. Is be something, or even evasion. How do you get? Maybe it's equipment. Maybe it's some of those. There's like 3 red spells. Creatures can't block this turn. That kind of thing.
I think you touched on a few things there that I've made some notes on, and I certainly agree with. We're at a point now where it's very difficult for me to try and recommend to people this kind of all-out strategy of beating people's heads in. With the premise of just kind of playing it again and trying again if it doesn't work the first time. There are commanders that I think can do it. They sacrifice the clock to some extent. I think, again, Arabella is cheap to recast, even twice. It's affordable to recast. It comes back. The damage is baked into the board with the creatures you've got. You can swing and do it again. Is it an aggro deck? You mentioned it might be close to mid-range. It wins around turn 7. It can win faster than that, but it usually errs around the turn 6, turn 7 mark. You're playing something like EC or Kedis, reasonable deck. It's a turn 6 deck, pretty consistently, not always, but most of the time. You trade off the explosivity of Dargo for extra protection in the zone. Does that make for a worthwhile trade-off? But then again, it's what we're seeing is when decks like Dargo Kelith, Kelith Kedis, and Dargo Kedis, all of which kind of somewhat slightly similar things, are trying to do a lot of damage by turn 4 to turn 5. I mean, if these decks can't close the game, it becomes very difficult to recommend outright aggro to people. It is worth noting that there are a few commanders that can kill people, like Heartfire Hero can kill a player very convincingly and very consistently on turn 3. And there's scope to explore decks which instead of eliminating everybody, look to eliminate 1 or 2 players very early on, between turns 3 and 5, and then figure out the rest amongst the next player at the table. But I guess my kind of core 4 points that I wanted to say for what my brief experience exploring aggro and my experience when talking to people who play aggro are the following. So the first one is you want a strict adherence to the clock. You need to know how fast your deck wins. It is not optional. You must know in a vacuum, on average, how fast your deck closes the game. For 2 reasons. The first one is that it's going to give you a strong understanding of how vulnerable your deck is to the meta and what changes you need to make. And the second one is it gives you a clear understanding of your threat assessment at the table. You need to understand who you're supposed to be attacking, if that's a relevant metric. And even in the case of decks like Arabella, with an attack trigger that hurts everybody, or Dargo, you still have the commander damage to think about. You still have to think about who you're attacking first. Understanding what other people's clocks are and how quickly they're looking to win, and the likelihood they have of finding interaction, will determine, or should inform, what you do at the table. And as a result, it is critical to understand how quickly you're looking to end the game. On the second point was deciding your strengths and weaknesses. Every deck is good at something. Every deck is bad at something. There are no exceptions. The best decks tend to be more good at stuff than they are bad at stuff, but they still have weaknesses. We mentioned Abdel. Abdel is slow in the initial 3 to 4 turns of the game. After that, very scary. Leon Lawweaver / Gretchen. Exceptional combo decks do not like being attacked, can't do much about it. Malcolm Kedis. Dependent on keeping 2 pieces in play, disruption or removal of either one of those pieces slows the whole thing down. Every deck accepts some kind of good and bad matchup by extension of its strengths and weaknesses. Trying to be a toolbox deck, in my view, when you're on aggro deck, where you take a bit of this and a bit of that, is just never going to work. In my view, you need to focus in on a small package of things that you are good at and ramp it up to 11. You can have small tech cards if you think that they are modal enough to accommodate the core game plan, but your focus should be on looking around the table, figuring out who the worst matchup is for you, and eliminating that player. That's your modus operandi 90% of the time, and implicit in that is accepting some kind of substantial weakness, with the trade-off being that you're much better at one thing. The third point is to build in resilience. Adam, you mentioned this already. You are going to get interrupted and removed once. This is where those kind of hybrid decks that have some kind of alternative game plan become more interesting. Again, a lot of like Shadow Spinner and Sprite Dragon, they're not strictly aggro, but if you are able to come back and win the game in spite of your threat being removed, I think it's an additional selling point. But beyond that, even if you are just recasting a Dargo or whatever, work out how likely it is that you are going to be able to do that. If you're playing Bird Horse, how likely is it that people are going to be playing Edicts to get past the protection that ECO brings? And what are you doing to mitigate that? How likely is it that you see 4 lands to be able to recast this commander? You need to know what these metrics look like. So hypergeometric calculators that can be used to work out how many lands to run and your likelihood of seeing X lands inside Y cards are very useful for this sort of thing. It is very, very important to take this seriously if you want to have a good chance of winning. It's a very hard archetype to play, but it is a lot of fun.
And one thing that was so well put. One thing I want to add into the resilience comment. You want to make sure that you have no wasted combat step. And part
100%.
of that, well, and part of that no wasted combat step, I mentioned Flaring Pain as an example, the anti-fog. I actually would encourage, and this is my take, some people can disagree with it, feel free to, but if you're running an aggro strategy with access to fogs, the classic aggro is, math is for blockers, right? You have 3 opponents. You're not going to get another combat step if you don't watch your life total.
100%.
So the permission that you give yourself to swing out can't be at the expense of another combat step that you're going to need.
No,
and so that's my take.
I can't agree enough.
Yep.
I mean, it's
Yep.
like one of the things I've learned when trying to figure out which aggro commanders are viable or not is just the importance of things that in most mid-range decks in particular would seem completely trivial. My favorite example of this is the comparison between Viashino's Slaughtermaster and Picnic Ruiner. Vyashin of Slaughtermaster is a reasonably popular casual commander. It's one of the few Jund commanders, 3-color commanders we have access to in the format. It's a 1 and a red for a 1/1 with double strike, and you can pay some amount of mana in order to give it +1/+1 till end of turn, which the ability is in black and green. By comparison, Picnic Ruiner is 1 and a red for a 2/2 with double strike, and a green sorcery which puts counters on stuff. Other creatures you have in play. The disparity between 1 and 2 power, in my view, completely omits Slaughtermaster as a choice, as a point of competition, in spite of access to black, because Picnic Ruiner can come down on turn 2, and with 2/+3 pump spells at 1 mana, which are plentiful in red, one-shot a player on turn 3, one-shot a player on turn 4, and one-shot a player on turn 5. 2 on each turn, 6 cards in total. By turn 5, you're going to have seen, 12 cards? Let's say 4 of them are lands. It's 8 cards. If one of them is a piece of interaction and the rest of them are the pump spells, you have enough to enact that. Hypothetically, in a turn 5 deck, the Slaughtermaster, by comparison, because it has 1 less power, when you give it +6 power, it hits for 14, not 16. And subsequently, the deck is a turn 8 deck rather than turn 15. Turn 15, excuse me, rather than turn 5. The tiniest differences in stats when you attach these commanders has radical implications for how quickly they can win games. And it's so essential to know exactly how fast your deck is trying to win and how likely you are to be able to enact that. Aggro is a raw math problem, and in my experience, aggro is won in the deck builder, not in games. Your deck, it should be a foregone conclusion that you are going to win certain pods when you sit down in seat 1, or as we find out, apparently seat 4, but you should sit down and think, I have the reach to kill each of these players. It should not be a point of uncertainty.
Couldn't agree more. And not to mention, that guy ruins picnics.
He does, dude.
I mean,
he's horrible
he
little
does.
turd of a creature. Little goblin
Yes.
turd. But okay, I've waffled at length. I appreciate you, Adam, putting up with me for this long. But just before we finished, I did want to end on a lighter note and talk about any pet suggestions we had for sort of aggro decks or aggro commanders that we thought might be interesting for people to explore, or that we might have explored in the past. Did you have anything?
Yeah.
I assigned you a homework assignment on this, so I hoped you came up with something.
I did, yeah. So one that I'm working on right now, Heritage Druid. I would love to see this deck take off. Green Stompy is a really fun archetype, I think, in general. And
did we ever define what it actually does? Because I don't think we did.
Yeah, so Heritage Druid is a 1-drop elf, so it's a 1/1 for 1 that reads, if you have 3 elves in play, you can tap them, and it has just the colon, so it's not actually a tap symbol. Tap 3 elves and add 3 green to the pool. So it's amazing how even playing Heritage Druid as the 3rd elf, it can tap 4 mana that turn that you play it. And so it allows you to go from hand to board very quickly, very, very quickly. It's also a very commander-centric build, so that's being a 1/1 for 1. There's some fragility there, but it can be explosive. It can get a board very, very quickly and big mana very, very quickly. So I'd love to see that turn into something. I'm working on it now.
It is really interesting. I was extremely skeptical, especially with the recent addition of Dionys to the pool. So Dionys is, I think it's Elvish Archdruid or something to that effect, is another mono green elf commander, 4 mana for a 3/3, and it says whenever an elf you control becomes tapped for the first time each turn, you untap it, put a counter on it, which means you can then double your mana, but also can swing with them and still tap them for mana if you're so inclined.
Interesting.
It's difficult to compete, right? But the big thing that I think the Heritage Druid has that's interesting is that you get started vomiting bodies out extremely fast. And then once you've got them out, you have this huge pool of mana to exploit. You also get cool stuff like, isn't there, Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a creature called something like Glistener Elf, which has Infect. And then there's another elf which says tap to give target creature power equal to the number of elves you control.
Timberwatch elf.
Dude, I've been yeeted off the table by the 10/10 elf with Infect before. It is very funny when it happens.
It's got legs. It's just it's a project, it's a pet project. I hope that somebody can crack the code before I do.
100%. So,
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I have done the aggro thing for a while intermittently. The first aggro deck I ever built was ECL Kedis. It was a turn 6 deck. You typically resolve ECL Wardwing Familiar on turn 2, and Kedis, I think it's Ember Claw Familiar on turn 3. And you then use basically a variety of pump spells and maybe some tempo pieces / interaction spells to just whittle people down. Your Fets cost people a
Yeah.
lot to interact with, which is very annoying. I took it to a tournament and got absolutely squashed.
Oh
It
no.
was absolutely horrific, bro. It was one of the worst tournaments of my life. It was not a good deck, and it was not a. I had been dishonest with myself during the building process. Exactly what I was talking about before. That's why I made such a impassioned case for knowing how consistent you are, and that I was looking at mostly at the good hands and disregarding the bad hands because I felt that you were supposed to mulligan aggressively aggro decks, and I had a horrendous time. So honesty is
You,
very important. On
you
the
know,
topic of,
in
go
some
on, sorry.
circles, I was just going to say, in some circles, they call that deck Chicken Lizard. Believe it or not.
Oh, really? That's sick. We have
Yeah,
to,
because
I'll
of the
have to
bird.
make
Yeah.
right chicken. I have to bring back the chicken lizard at some point.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the idea of bringing having like a secondary threat or some sense of resiliency.
Hmm.
There's a couple of commanders that hybrid decks I've been working on recently. The one that I think is most relevant to talk about is Brushfire Elemental. This is not a new creature. Anyone who's been in the format for a while knows Brushfire Elemental. It's a red and a green for a 1/1. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and it gets +2/+2 whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. So
Hmm.
you play a sacrifice land, it gets +4/+4 till end of turn. Look, the selling point of Rush of Elemental is that it can often kill a player on turn 4 without anything except getting lands, like ramping effectively, right? And in most cases kills that player on turn 5 without too much difficulty. And so the deck is split between interaction, ramp, lands is essential, and then threats. So I think my current brew that I now own on paper runs something like 23 different creatures. And I will say, however good or bad it is, this deck is liberating to play because you really can just turn your brain off. Like you play this guy, you ramp, just pure gruel. You throw down cards. You're looking at hitting for 1 damage on turn 2. The turn it comes down. 5 damage to 7 damage on turn 3. Again, somewhere between 5 and 9 damage on turn 4. If you have to kill that player on turn 5, if you haven't already killed them, you do so. You start playing big threats around turn 5, and you just go from there. You know, you're abusing cards like Skyshroud Claim. You're abusing cards like Ranger's Path. Kadama's Reach, cards like Far Travelings, which can get 3 lands and put them directly into play if you have Threshold. Uh, Green and red gives you like, and take your pick of exceptionally efficient big creatures. Sort of anything from 5 mana neat creatures to way up, give you the Monarch or whatever, all the way up to sort of 10 mana creatures like Rust Goliath if you want to go extremely tall. And so once you have the Brush Elemental has done its initial job of yeeting a player off the table, you try to finish the job with both the commander and these other threats that you're playing. It's been I got to stress again, I haven't had a lot of success with it so far. There's still some fine tuning to do, but this for me has been my attempt to incorporate some of what I've learned about needing to very much understand how fast the deck is intending to be, and have some alternative condition baked into the back to help you win the game.
Yeah, it's a really fun. I've piloted it before too, and
Oh yeah.
Ben is not wrong. If you want to have fun playing Magic and just enjoy yourself, Brushfire Elemental is a great time.
It's so fun, dude. It's like
Yeah.
beating someone to death with a clump of grass is like a religious experience. It's such a flavorful little creature. It's such a stupid, like it's literally a chunk of sentient grass that's on fire, and you beat people to death with it. It's like you really couldn't design a better Gruul creature than this. Shout out also to again Picnic Ruiner, fantastic Gruul creature. If you care about Gruul, you've got options like Wildfire Wickerfolk was one me and Adam were high on for a long time. We never really managed to make
Yes.
that work, but like 2 mana for a 3/2 with haste that gets +1/+1 on trample if you have Delirium. Um, there are a lot of cool little creatures that haven't quite got perceived to have quite got the reach, or haven't had the necessary interest to crack them. And I think to close on a positive note, my view is that Aggro is just fun. I think it's a fundamentally different way of playing the game than most other archetypes offer. It's a game which requires mathematical rigor, but once you actually get into games, you've already done the hard work. You no longer care about the outcome. You're just there to ruin someone's day. And I think uh, if you haven't ever played an aggro deck because you're put off, try it once or twice, and your experience of Magic at large and how seriously you take individual games will evaporate. You will just enjoy Magic at large more.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's beautiful, and it's definitely, it leans into the tactical side of gameplay in my mind a little bit more than the developed strategy and following the plan. It just shows you that Magic has a little bit of something for everybody, and yeah, Aggro's so much fun. I can't say anymore. You did.
All right.
You said it.
So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This was a harder conversation to have than the previous one, so it might feel a little jilted at times, but we put a lot of work into researching it. Please do leave us feedback in the comments below. We want to know what you think and what you'd be interested in hearing us waffle about. If there is a demand for the data that we've mentioned in this episode, we can make that available. But otherwise, Adam, I don't know, you've got anything else you want to say before we close this one out?
No, I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, and you stay classy, San Diego.
All right, take care, guys.